So Congressman Thomas Massie went on the Redacted show, and this came across the wire last night. Thomas Massie believes the U.S. government orchestrated, or at the very least facilitated, regime change in Syria. The timing is definitely not a mistake. So this is interesting. Let's take a look at this video.
Timing of this. Remember, Tulsi Gabbard was in Congress, and she and I collaborated on a lot of these efforts to stop our meddling, the U.S. meddling in Syria. And now she's been named as the head of DNI. Well, I think that was the signal to the deep state to go in for the kill and get this over with, because Trump and some of his nominees like Tulsi Gabbard are signaling that we are not going to carry on the policies of Obama and the deep state.
So that's why, I've been thinking that we've been talking about that on our show, that it seemed the timing of all of this just seems incredibly fishy. So it is your assessment that this was really an effort here before Trump gets into office to go in and basically put in place this sort of deep state CIA plan in Syria. It's clear as day to you, it seems.
It's clear as day to me. And, whether it was led by the United States or whether we just encouraged it, definitely the timing is not a mistake. When you find a turtle on a fence post, it didn't get there by accident. So, for instance, some of the stronger powers that be, like Israel, they used their military forces to bomb the dozens of jets and helicopters in Syria. Basically, what these terrorists couldn't do, other people in the Middle East hurry up and did here in this last week to make sure that Assad didn't have the typical resources that a government would have to respond to these threats.
I mean, I think he's pretty much right on that. I might nitpick when he gets into the weeds. Is it the Tulsi appointment that did it, or is it just the Trump victory that did it? I mean, there have been mixed signals coming out of the Trump team, to put it mildly, about their commitment to overturning the deep state's apple cart. Mixed signals is probably too much of a chance.
She hasn't said a word about this.
Right, exactly. And so mixed signals may be too much of a chance for them to take. And I do agree, like Biden, pretty much made no secret of the fact that he's authorizing long-range missile strikes into Russia because he's concerned about what's going to happen with this war effort after he leaves office. Democrats have been very open about that. The media has been very open about that, as we're going to see in the next piece. But the other piece about Israel.
And that's also why they just transferred the $20 billion in frozen Russian assets to Ukraine, which without going through Congress, they can't even approve for military use. So you know what that's doing? That's paying their payrolls. That's paying their pensions. That's paying their health care. While people are freezing in tents in North Carolina, we send $20 billion in frozen Russian assets to Ukraine for their public services, which also, by the way, further undermines the dollar as the reserve currency, because doing something like that destroys the rationale for using it as a safe place to put your money.
Right. So they've been pretty open about that, right? That, hey, time is of the essence here because Trump's taking over, so we better try and lock in place our agenda as best we can to sort of Trump-proof it, if you will, for the next 4 years. The other part about that, in terms of Israel striking Syria, them doing what they can do in advance of a potential foreign policy shift, that's another very important point to make as well. And this is what explains fealty to Israel on our part. It's not because they're Jews. It's because they're Europeans. It's because they are Westerners in that part of the world. They are our aircraft carrier. That's what RFK said pretty openly, and that is what explains that. Okay, so in terms of the clock ticking, Time Magazine published this op-ed, which is a pretty astounding op-ed. We're not going to read the whole thing. But if you look at the title here, Syria could be the beginning of the end of Russia's imperial ambitions. And then you look at the byline. Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, John Herbst, Robert Hormats, and Stephen Henriques. I'm going to read the bios from these people. I should have put this in the slideshow. I didn't think to do it until too late, so I have it on my phone here. This is from the piece. So Sonnenfeld, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, is the Crown Professor of Leadership Practice and president of the Yale Chief Executive Leadership Institute. He's been an informal advisor to 5 U.S. presidents and assisted Jared Kushner in the 2019 Peace Through Prosperity Conference in Bahrain, which outlined the Abraham Accords and a global investment fund to lift the Palestinian and neighboring Arab state economies and fund a $5 billion transportation corridor to connect the West Bank and Gaza. Herbst is a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan and a senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. He served for 31 years as a foreign service officer in the U.S. State Department. He worked to enhance U.S.-Ukrainian relations and helped ensure the conduct of a fair Ukrainian presidential election and prevent violence during the Ukrainian Revolution. Hormats, third byline, former U.S. Undersecretary of State, has been a senior official in the administration of 5 American presidents across political parties. He also served as vice chairman of Goldman Sachs International and vice chair of Kissinger Associates, and is now managing director at Tiedemann Advisors. He was a top-level envoy with Henry Kissinger during the shuttle diplomacy in the Mideast, with frequent negotiations with Syria's Assad regime. Henriques, a senior research fellow at the Yale Chief Executive Leadership Institute and a former consultant to McKinsey & Company, with expertise in the aerospace and defense industry. So the reason I read those biographies is you want a glimpse into the deep state mind. Here it is.
That's like the resume of a typical resident of hell.
Exactly. Like, look, you add up all these people. Okay, so this is the deep state. This is what this is. That is the kind of entrenched power that we're talking about as represented in the people who wrote this. So we're going to read the highlights of this. Vladimir Putin is running out of time with his crumbling economy and overstretched, faltering army trying to advance his ill-advised invasion of Ukraine, while attempting to suppress pro-democracy activists in several nations around his intended sphere of influence. Now, almost 3 years into his big invasion of Ukraine, that was supposed to be won in 3 days, he has been counting on the return of Donald Trump to the White House to undermine Allied support for Ukraine. It need not happen this way. They even say right here, plain black ink. The next 50 days provide a historic opportunity for the assertion of national independence from Putin's control in several Eastern European lands. In 1946, the revered U.S. diplomat George Kennan prophetically warned of a domino theory of nations around Russia falling into a larger Soviet Union. Now we may be on the brink of seeing a reverse domino effect, as we did in the 90s when nations broke away from Russia. As the Syrian rebel force Hayat Tahrir al-Sham swept through Aleppo and then Damascus in a matter of hours, toppling the 60-year reign of the al-Assad family dynasty, cheers and chants are echoing throughout the streets of the capital, celebrating the downfall of an authoritarian regime long supported by Russia and Iran. Both countries have used Syria as a strategic regional outpost in service of their commercial and military interests. However, the vast resources Russia and Iran once held have either been destroyed and committed to other failing conquests. In fact, it is the collapse of support from Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah that contributed to the surprise sweep of Syria, as the demoralized military under President Bashar al-Assad's strict control reportedly did nothing to resist rebel forces. What happens in Syria next is unclear, but the U.S. should certainly be working with Turkey to stabilize the situation while closely coordinating with all parties in the anti-Assad coalition. Some 700 miles to the north, the shouts of protesters and pops from their fireworks can be heard in the streets of Tbilisi, Georgia, where demonstrators continue their weeks-long call for an end to the pro-Russian ruling party in parliament and entry into the EU. The house of cards that Vladimir Putin has so carefully stacked over more than 2 decades is folding before our eyes. Not only are his satellite states rejecting Kremlin influence, but the Russian economy is crumbling, lurching towards severe stagflation. Russia is at a classic tipping point in its long, admirable history, that's nice of them to say, as Putin desperately hangs on in hope that Trump will wind down U.S. engagement and permit Russia to seize Ukraine in stages. Putin's fate may very well be in the hands of Trump, but so too are critical American interests, as well as those of its allies in Ukraine. Putin's hopes for Trump may well be disappointed. The president-elect has said Ukraine's survival is important to the U.S. He therefore does not want to broker a peace deal that only imposes conditions on the victim and allows the aggressor to come back for the rest of Ukraine. A U.S. exit imposing an appeasement plan would be the equivalent to Neville Chamberlain handing Hitler the Sudetenland, which of course only fueled that tyrant's territorial ambitions. The good news for Ukraine is that Trump likes to negotiate a favorable deal, and Russia is growing weaker by the day. In just a few days last week, the loose coalition of resistance fighters ended a cruel, dynastic reign in Syria, as Russia and Iran were too distracted to bring air cover to their ally, the despotic President Bashar al-Assad. If Syrians could seize this moment, perhaps so too can Eastern Europeans, as they themselves did in rapid succession during the 90s. So there you go. I mean, that may as well be a memo, right? I mean, that's basically an open letter, right, to Biden and to Trump, right? They're trying to shape foreign policy as best they can so that once the transition happens, Trump is compelled to just further himself down that road because, hey, you got to think of Ukraine as well. And I think the timing of this, as Massie said earlier, is not coincidental. This happened in the lame duck session. We've seen a lot of major escalation during this lame duck session. And that is the permanent state trying to put as much wind as Joe Biden's back as they can to keep going and to set things on a course to then encourage Donald Trump, hey, you can't pull back now.
Yeah. If we didn't have Hitler, we would need to invent him, right? The idea of comparing this military situation to Hitler in the 30s.
Well, of course, that's absurd.
It's just absurd. We did a piece the other day, the same one we got into the military bases. Russia is not even running a close third in military spending. It's lumped in with the 20 next countries who don't equal the United States military spending. The idea that if you come to a settlement with Russia, even a settlement where they take a substantial amount of Ukrainian territory, that's a prelude to Russia having the capability, set aside inclination, the military capability to invade the West. Absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. And that is a good example of how, as our friend Nick often points out, Americans are the most propagandized people on earth. Really, not the North Koreans, not China, not Venezuela or any of the other bugaboos. It really is America, because it's in the pages of what? Newsweek?
That's Time.
Time, same thing.
Yeah.
So that's really for the PMC class to get their marching orders and their propaganda. That's how they get the PMCs shitting their pants about Vladimir Putin, as if that has any meaningful impact on their lives.
Please clap.